Hello, my friends. The meeting in Geneva between U.S. officials and European leaders revealed once again the fundamental split in the Western approach to the Ukraine conflict, and even more importantly, the growing desperation inside the Western bloc. Publicly, Western governments still present the situation as if they control the tempo of events. In reality, the battlefield is dictating everything, and Russia is the only actor whose position continues to strengthen. The political theater in Geneva exposed the truth. Europe is still clinging to illusions, Washington is scrambling to avoid humiliation, and Kiev is sinking deeper into a position from which no Western intervention can rescue it. The Europeans arrived at the talks with a counterproposal to the U.S. peace framework, a counterproposal knowingly designed for one purpose: to be rejected by Russia. This was intentional. Brussels and several large EU capitals want to shape the narrative so that any failure in the negotiations can be blamed on Moscow. By offering terms that no rational Russian leadership would accept, the Europeans create the appearance that Russia refuses peace, while continuing to push for policies that prolong a war Ukraine can no longer win. The centerpiece of the European counterproposal is the insistence on a ceasefire before discussing territorial realities. But Moscow has repeatedly and unequivocally rejected this sequencing. Russia understands that a premature ceasefire would allow Ukraine to rearm, retrain, and rebuild under heavy NATO supervision, exactly the pattern that followed the Minsk agreements, where Ukraine used the pause not as a path to settlement, but as preparation for war. Russia will not repeat that mistake. A ceasefire before settling the core issues would simply extend the conflict and create a more dangerous war later. European officials know this. Their goal is not peace, but optics. When one examines the amendments inserted into the U.S. draft by European leaders, a clear pattern emerges. Europe wants to remove any constraints on NATO, preserve maximal demands for Kyiv, and preserve the narrative of Russia as an aggressor forced into concessions. Washington, despite maintaining its own political ambitions, at least understands the military situation. Europe does not. One of the first European changes was the deletion of the clause that Russia is expected not to interfere in its neighbors' affairs, while NATO is not expected to expand further. The language of this clause was so vague that it carried no binding meaning in the first place. Russia would never accept such vague rhetoric because not expected is not a commitment, it is a polite shrug. NATO is a military bloc whose entire history consists of expansion. Moscow has said repeatedly that paper promises from NATO are worthless. European leaders nevertheless demanded the removal of the clause, not because it mattered strategically, but because it symbolically constrained NATO's ambition to incorporate Ukraine. Another major alteration concerns the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. The U.S. proposal suggested a limit of roughly 600,000 troops. Europe raised it to 800,000. The idea that Russia would accept a heavily armed, NATO-integrated military of nearly 1 million soldiers directly on its border after fighting a war to prevent exactly that outcome is absurd. But again, the intention is not to create a workable agreement. The intention is to keep alive the mythology that Ukraine can return as a massive U.S. trained military power, even while its brigades are being ground down on the battlefield. More striking is the European insistence that Ukraine retain an open path to NATO membership. The U.S. proposal had suggested that Ukraine adopt constitutional neutrality and that NATO commit never to admit it. European leaders rejected this outright. Their amendment reframes NATO membership as contingent on consensus, while simultaneously acknowledging that this consensus does not currently exist. This is a clever rhetorical device. It keeps the door open for NATO expansion without committing to anything concrete. But it is also the exact red line that triggered Russia's intervention. Europe, fully aware of this, insists on keeping the provocation active. Even more revealing is the clause regarding NATO troop presence. The U.S. draft banned NATO forces in Ukraine entirely. Europe amended this to say NATO would not station troops permanently in peacetime, implicitly leaving the door open for coalition forces to deploy in wartime. Translated, Europe wants to reserve the right to send NATO soldiers into Ukraine if a direct Russia-NATO confrontation occurs. This is a dangerous and unserious idea, yet it fits the European pattern of symbolic signaling with no strategic depth. The changes regarding sanctions and Russia's reintegration into the global economy demonstrate the same mindset. Europe proposes a piecemeal conditional approach in which sanctions are lifted only in areas beneficial to EU economies, while punitive measures that harm Russia can remain indefinitely under review. In other words, the Europeans want to lift the sanctions that hurt them while keeping the sanctions that hurt Russia. This asymmetric framework is a non-starter for Moscow, and European leaders know it. One of the most arrogant components of the European Amendment is the insistence that Ukraine must be fully reconstructed using Russian sovereign assets, and that these assets will remain frozen until Russia pays compensation. The U.S. plan had included a mechanism allowing for a gradual return of some frozen Russian funds through investment structures, an attempt, however clumsy, to create a face-saving exit for the West. Europe rejected this, preferring to maintain the maximalist narrative that Russia should finance the rebuilding of the country the West used as a proxy. Again, they do not expect Russia to accept this. They simply want to control the narrative. Other European edits reveal ideological motives. They removed a U.S. clause banning extremist ideologies in Ukraine and replaced it with vague EU language on religious tolerance and minority protections, a strikingly toothless formulation, likely designed to avoid confronting the extremist factions operating openly in Ukraine. This amendment alone exposes how deeply Brussels is invested in maintaining certain political narratives inside Ukraine. The final set of amendments concerns legal provisions. The U.S. plan had proposed broad amnesty for all parties involved in the conflict. Europe removed this, insisting instead on language about addressing the suffering of victims, avoiding any commitment to neutrality or amnesty. Translated, Europe wants open-ended legal leverage over Russia while offering nothing in return. These amendments are not elements of a peace plan. They are instruments of political messaging. The European Union is not preparing Ukraine for peace. It is preparing itself for its own internal political transformation. Brussels has become increasingly clear about its long-term ambition to evolve from a loose union of states into a federal structure modeled on the United States. For Brussels, the Ukraine war has become a mechanism to centralize power. By invoking solidarity with Ukraine, Brussels justifies unprecedented interventions in a member state policy, from defense budgets to industrial restructuring to energy policy. Ukraine is not the end. Ukraine is the tool. In contrast, NATO has not evolved. It remains a military alliance. Its relevance depends on the creation of threats. Without a Russian adversary, NATO loses its purpose. And without NATO, the United States loses its most effective instrument of political control over Europe. Thus, the war serves Washington as well, though Washington's goals are not identical to Europe's. The Biden administration used the war to tighten American influence over European energy and defense markets. The Trump administration, by contrast, views the war as a liability that must be frozen before it becomes a catastrophic strategic defeat. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk's recent statements highlight Europe's political sensitivities. Tusk publicly questioned who authored the EU plan, implying distrust and irritation that Washington is crafting terms without European oversight. His comments resemble a person rejecting a gift simply because they dislike the giver, yet hurrying to purchase the same object themselves. This pettiness reveals a deeper insecurity. European leaders are discovering that they no longer control the Western political narrative. Rubio's comments after the Geneva discussions made this imbalance clear. He openly stated that the United States walked the Europeans through the progress, signaling that the U.S. sees itself as the senior actor and Europe as a subordinate stakeholder whose input is limited to matters that concern Europe and NATO directly. Issues concerning Ukraine itself remain under U.S. jurisdiction. Europe complains, but Washington does not yield. Meanwhile, American senators such as Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell are demanding congressional oversight of any Ukraine settlement, arguing that the U.S. must ensure Russia is pressured into difficult concessions. Their comments betray a profound misunderstanding. Victors do not make concessions. Russia has no reason to grant the West anything that resembles a win, and Russia is not negotiating under duress. History itself answers McConnell's argument. After World War I, the West imposed the harsh Versailles Treaty on Germany without making concessions. After World War II, The Allies dictated the terms to Germany completely. Those who win dictate concessions, those who lose accept them. Ukraine is not in a position to dictate anything, and the West can no longer impose terms militarily. This is why Russia remains unbothered by the Western debate. None of these proposals acknowledge the fundamental reality that Russia is winning the war. None of them reflect the strategic position Russia has secured, and none of them appreciate the irreversible collapse of Ukraine's military capacity. As long as the West refuses to accept reality, any negotiation is theater. With that, the spectacle in Geneva ends exactly where it began. Western governments negotiating among themselves, while the only actor with real leverage, Russia, watches from a distance, shaping events not through rhetoric but through victory on the battlefield. The Geneva peace talks on Ukraine, which began on Sunday, are being marketed in Western capitals as a serious diplomatic effort. In practice, what is unfolding there is a familiar Western ritual, internal bargaining among U.S., European, and Ukrainian delegates over how to present a plan that Russia has not even accepted as a basis for negotiation. The parties in the room are the United States, key European states, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, and Ukraine. Their stated purpose is to discuss President Trump's peace proposal. Their unstated purpose is to reshape that proposal into something that protects Western political narratives, preserves NATO's strategic ambitions, and delays the inevitable reckoning with battlefield realities. To understand the EU's role here, you do not need to guess at motives. You only need to read what Europeans are doing. After 3 years of conflict, Europe still has not produced a serious independent peace initiative. Its only consistent demand has been Russian surrender, dressed up in euphemisms about restoring sovereignty and defending values. That is why the European entrance into Geneva is not a sign of constructive engagement, but of sabotage by amendment. Brussels and leading European capitals wanted a seat at the table precisely to hollow out whatever parts of the U.S. Framework might have been negotiable for Moscow, so that Russia can be blamed for rejecting what Europe has already ensured will be rejected. The European counter-proposal is not a separate plan. It is a line-by-line rewrite of Trump's outline framed as amendments and deletions. This approach is strategic in its cynicism. Europe avoids having to admit openly that it rejects any peace that doesn't look like Russian capitulation, while still preserving the claim that it is working for peace. But the actual edits show the opposite. The Europeans have taken the most sensitive Russian security concerns that long predate 2022, and removed or reversed them in ways that guarantee Moscow cannot accept the end product. One of the most revealing edits is the European deletion of point 3 in the U.S. draft. That point stated that Russia was expected not to interfere in the affairs of its neighbors, and that NATO was not expected to expand further. Whatever flaws that U.S. wording had, it at least acknowledged that NATO expansion is not a side issue, it is central to the conflict. Russia has warned for decades that NATO's march eastward, the militarization of Ukraine, and the conversion of Ukrainian territory into a forward operating platform for Western power would be treated as an existential threat. That warning was ignored until it became a war. Europe's decision to remove even the faintest reference to NATO limits is therefore not accidental. It is a declaration that Europe still refuses to accept that NATO's behavior helped create this conflict, and Europe still wants to preserve the option of NATO expansion whenever it suits Western strategy. This fits the broader European pattern throughout the war. Deny the causes, moralize the consequences, and then demand that Russia accept Western terms after Russia has already beaten Ukraine and outlasted Western escalation. It is a political fantasy, and it is precisely why Russia has repeatedly insisted that any settlement must address root causes first, not abstract slogans about expectations. For Moscow, a peace plan that refuses to close the NATO question is not a peace plan at all. It is a pause designed to restart the war later under worse conditions for Russia. No serious Russian leadership would ever accept it. The European edit on Ukrainian force size is equally inflammatory. The U.S. draft capped Ukraine's armed forces at 600,000. Europe raised this to 800,000 inches peacetime. Let's be blunt, even 600,000 was already miles away from Russian objectives. Russia has been explicit that demilitarization is a core outcome, not a preference, not a bargaining chip, but a foundational security requirement. A Ukraine with an 800,000 strong military, trained and supplied by NATO, is not neutral or safe. It is a permanently mobilized anti-Russian garrison. Europe must know this. which is why the edit is, again, less about feasibility than about narrative. It allows European leaders to pretend they are protecting Ukraine while actually ensuring Russia will reject the plan and the war can be prolonged. Europe also avoids answering its own practical questions. Who would fund such a force? Ukraine's economy is shattered. Europe is already scrambling for frozen Russian assets because it cannot sustain Ukraine on its own budgets much longer. Maintaining 800,000 troops indefinitely means a colossal and permanent financial commitment. Yet the same European states pushing this amendment are openly fatigued, politically fractured, and economically pressured. The amendment is therefore not a real military plan. It is a statement of ideological hostility toward Russia, smuggled into diplomacy. Then there is point 7, the NATO membership clause. The U.S. draft required Ukraine to constitutionally renounce NATO membership and for NATO to commit formally never to admit Ukraine. Europe replaced this with a slippery formula. Ukraine's NATO accession depends on consensus among NATO members, which does not exist. This is not a neutral compromise, it is a trapdoor. It keeps NATO membership alive as a future option, depending on political shifts inside NATO. Today, there is no consensus. Tomorrow, after a new U.S. administration, the consensus could be manufactured. Europe knows that Russia sees NATO membership for Ukraine as the red line that led directly to this war. So, inserting a clause that preserves NATO's open door is a deliberate provocation. And because Europe is unwilling to confront the reality that NATO expansion triggered the conflict, it tries to repackage the same pressure in softer language. But Russia is not negotiating with euphemisms. Moscow negotiates with strategic outcomes. Thus, any plan leaving NATO membership on the table is dead before it reaches a Russian desk. Point 8 is another textbook example. The U.S. draft banned any NATO forces in Ukraine. Europe amended this to say NATO will not permanently station troops under its command in Ukraine during peacetime. The loophole is obvious. It allows deployments in wartime and allows deployments by NATO countries outside formal NATO structures. This opens the door to what Europeans call a coalition of the willing, which in practice would mean Western boots on the ground under some alternative label. For Russia, this is indistinguishable from NATO expansion in uniform. The entire purpose of Russia's operation has been to prevent Ukraine from becoming a Western military platform. Europe's edit tries to preserve that platform. Again, sabotage by design. The Reconstruction and Assets Clause is perhaps the most arrogant of all. Europe insists Ukraine must be reconstructed using frozen Russian sovereign assets, and those assets will remain frozen until Russia pays compensation. The U.S. draft, self-interested as it was, at least attempted a pathway that could return some assets through investment mechanisms, offering a face-saving off-ramp for both sides. Europe removed that pathway entirely. It wants the assets kept as leverage and punishment. From the Russian perspective, this is not reconstruction. It is legalized theft. These are not charity funds. They are sovereign assets seized outside any legitimate international judicial process. Europe's amendment therefore demands that Russia accept a precedent that any Western coalition can seize a country's reserves and then condition their return on political obedience. No major power on earth would accept such a precedent. Russia certainly will not. Europe's removal of the amnesty clause reveals the same moral weaponization. The U.S. draft proposed full amnesty for all parties. Europe deleted it and replaced it with vague language about victim suffering. Under this change, Russia is left exposed to selective prosecutions, propaganda tribunals, and long-term legal warfare, including the European fantasy of branding Putin a war criminal. This amendment is not about justice. It is about keeping a sword over Russia's head even after a settlement, ensuring that Europe retains moral blackmail indefinitely. Again, Russia cannot accept a settlement that turns peace into a trap. Taken together, these edits show that Europe's objective has not changed since February 2022. Weaken Russia permanently, sustain Ukraine as a forward anti-Russian buffer, and keep NATO's strategic project alive. European officials say this openly when they think their words will not be scrutinized. They repeatedly claim that any peace must be just, lasting, and comprehensive. But then they define just as Russian defeat and lasting as NATO's continued expansion. Their real program is simple and has been admitted in plain language: weaken Russia and support Ukraine. That is not a peace strategy. It is a war strategy now disguised as diplomacy because the war is moving against them. What makes Europe's position increasingly dangerous for itself is that it is now colliding with momentum it cannot stop. Russia is winning on the battlefield. This is not a slogan, it is the structural reality behind every diplomatic tremor. Russia's forces are advancing in multiple directions. Ukraine's manpower pool is shrinking, its defenses are eroding, and Western ammunition and financial pipelines are reaching limits. Europe's attempt to dictate maximalist terms while losing the war is a form of strategic denial that will only deepen its eventual humiliation. Russia's own position, by contrast, remains consistent and rational. Moscow has said it prefers a diplomatic outcome, but it is not in a rush. The reason is obvious: time is working for Russia. The longer Europe delays reality, the more territory Russia secures, the more Ukraine's military dissolves, and the more favorable Moscow's terms become. Russia is not fighting for symbolic lines on a map. It is fighting to remove the military threat on its border and to prevent NATO from embedding itself in Ukraine forever. Those goals are not negotiable away by Western word games. This is why European leaders are now panicking. They see the battlefield shifting. They see Washington trying to freeze the war before it collapses entirely. They fear being left holding responsibility for a failed proxy conflict. So they scramble to re-enter talks, not to make them succeed, but to ensure that if they fail, Europe can say Russia refused peace. That narrative may help Europe domestically for a while. It will not change outcomes. Indeed, Europe's strategy of delay and sabotage is beginning to backfire. The more openly European leaders behave as spoilers, the more visible their incompetence becomes even to their own publics. Their foreign policy class has driven Europe into energy shocks, industrial decline, fractured trade relations, and growing insecurity, all while claiming moral superiority. Their political elite has sacrificed European prosperity to prolong a war that Europe cannot win and whose costs Europe cannot bear. The longer this continues, the more Europe isolates itself not only from Russia, but from much of the world that sees through the performance. In that sense, Europe's most hawkish figures have paradoxically become the clearest proof of Europe's strategic bankruptcy. Their bluntness, their ideological rigidity, and their inability to adapt expose the underlying motives they try to hide. They do not protect Europe, they endanger it. They do not secure Ukraine, they bleed it. They do not defend international law, they weaponize it selectively. Every time they speak, they reveal that peace is not their aim, control is. What happens next is predictable. Europe will present its rewritten plan as reasonable, Russia will reject it, as it must. Europe will then declare that Russia doesn't want peace while demanding more sanctions and more weapons. Washington will pretend to keep negotiating while privately recalculating how to exit without admitting defeat. Ukraine will be pushed to accept a freeze that cannot restore its position, even as it continues losing ground. And Russia will continue advancing until the West finally accepts that peace must be built on reality, not on fantasies from conferences far from the front lines. The core truth remains the same. You cannot negotiate a settlement while refusing to acknowledge who is winning the war and why the war began. Russia's security demands were clear long before 2022. NATO expansion and Ukrainian militarization were not misunderstandings. They were deliberate Western choices. Russia is now imposing the correction to those choices by force because diplomacy was exhausted and ignored. Europe can shout slogans all at once. The battlefield is already writing the treaty. If Europe truly wanted peace, it would stop playing semantic games, stop trying to preserve a NATO bridgehead in Ukraine, and stop demanding that Russia accept political punishment after victory. But Europe does not want that kind of peace. It wants a peace where Russia loses without losing, where Ukraine wins without winning, and where NATO expands even after being the spark of the war. That is not peace. That is denial. Russia, for its part, is approaching this with cold strategic clarity. It will not accept a ceasefire that allows Ukraine to rebuild for another round. It will not accept NATO membership disguised as future consensus. It will not accept Western troops in Ukraine under alternative flags. It will not accept its assets being stolen as a precondition for settlement. And it will not accept a legal trap designed to criminalize its leadership after the fact. These are not bargaining positions. They are the minimum conditions for a stable arrangement in which Russia's border is no longer threatened. So Geneva is not the place where peace will be decided. Peace will be decided where power is decided, on the ground. When Europe finally understands that, it will discover that diplomacy becomes possible again, but only after abandoning the illusion that it can still dictate the outcome. Russia does not need Europe to approve its security. Russia needs Europe to stop trying to undermine it. Until that happens, the war will go on, and Russia will keep shaping the map and the terms because it is the only side capable of doing so.